Welcome to SIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, hosting the third Islamophobia conference uh, here at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. We are going to conclude today's day with our last session of the day, the fifth out of 8 sessions. We also have the conference is from March 26th to the 30th. It's examining the global war on terror. Our panel today is moderated by Mr. Ubaid Ruff. He is a research fellow and editor at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. He's also assistant to the rector at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. Mr. Ruff has many credentials, especially in the field of Islamophobia. He has led a number of legal and political initiatives in examining the issue. Ubaid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Uwais. Assalamu alaikum. Yak Shamlar from Istanbul, Turkey. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we have a very exciting panel again tonight. I apologize if you are a friend of our colleague Linda Hayoki and are logging in to support her. We wish her well. She's at the border. She's safe, but border things happen. She's fine. Tonight's panel, we will begin. The topic that we're discussing is the alarming effects of the global war on terror. The first speaker discussing the radicalization and the securitization of Muslim youth will be presenting Tariq Yunus. He's at Middlesex University. Next will be Fahed Qureshi at Staffordshire University in the UK, discussing the intertwining of Islamophobia and contemporary racism. And our final speaker tonight will be Lina Al-Aryan of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms in Washington, D.C. on the topic, Understanding the Human Impact of the War on Terror. Before I introduce our first speaker, reminder to everyone, we would like lively question and answer session at the end. We'll save our questions to the end. You can make your questions in the comment section. They will be forwarded to me, and I'm happy to field those questions to our speakers. Our first speaker, Tariq Yunus, is a critical clinical psychologist and currently a lecturer in psychology at Middlesex University. His previous research has explored racialization of Muslims as a result of statutory counterterrorism policies in British mental health. Dr. Yunus has written on Western Muslim identities, Islamophobia, securitization, racism of the healthcare settings, and the marginalization of Muslims through colorblind policies. He teaches on the significance of culture, race, religion, globalization, and security policies in mental health. Tariq, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time this evening. If you can, please limit your presentation to 20 minutes. And if you are ready, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Sorry, just going to put it full screen. Can you see the, do you see the presentation slides or the main slides?
Yeah, I see it's the presentation slide.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and to be speaking about. So I think there's been some juggling of the words. I'll be speaking mostly about the psychologization through the securitization and racialization of Muslims. So it doesn't matter really the order of the words we put it in, we'll figure it out by the end. And I'm really delighted to be here. I was just thinking as I'm preparing for this presentation and for this conference, it's really delightful to actually not have to begin by sort of introducing the global war on terror and to jump right in. So I think just quick brief history, because I'm going to be speaking about psychologization, which I think for many is a relatively novel concept, or they might sort of understand it intuitively. But one of the things that we need to understand in terms of the history of psychology is that psychology as a modern discipline is very much an artifact of Western history. And much of the research in psychology has developed through, through nationalist policies, through war. Especially war has been a very significant sort of incubator for psychological research. When we talk about research on resilience, on identity, a lot of that was initially funded through war. But moreover, as many people have documented, historically speaking, it's really been psychology and sort of the what I'm going to talk about, the therapeutic ethos, so the therapeutic rhetoric has been foundational for trying to understand technologies of surveillance and the management of subjectivity, so the management of people's thoughts and behaviors. It's often used sort of as a platform to understand and calculate the will of the people, to manage what Mark Sageman calls the protest class, and obviously increasingly to identify pre-crime, which is very significant. Now, there's been, people have already been writing against this for a long time. One of them, obviously, being Frantz Fanon, who's written about this sort of the epistemological subjugation through the psi disciplines and the medicalization of social suffering. And this is really, really significant in trying to understand contemporary war on terror. So I know at least Fahad Qureshi is going to be speaking about Islamophobia and sort of relating to how Muslims are racialized. I think one of the things that's very significant in trying to understand the impact of the war on terror, the impact particularly of what, drawing on my own research of the PREVENT policy, which was already introduced in this conference, which, just to say very briefly, is a policy established within public bodies that anyone working in public body has the duty to have due regard to identify and refer individuals they suspect might become terrorists in the future. And here I think it's important to understand a sort of distinction between illiberal and liberal forms of racism. And this is sort of especially where the rhetoric of PREVENT fits in, because often when we accuse PREVENT of racism, there's this point whereby people have a very difficult time understanding how this war on terror policy can all be racist when, first of all, it's not only going hypothetically after Muslims, it's, it's not particularly, it's not written out anymore to focus on any particular subpopulation. So I'm going to talk about the psychologization of it. And I think it's often under this register of this illiberal racism that people understand what racism is, right? So when they think about illiberal racism, referring to sort of neo-Nazis, referring to KKK, whereby liberal racism, as people have written about, great book recently called Reactionary Democracy talks about this very well, operates on these ideological registers of nationalism, of capitalism, whereby there's these divisions that we know of between good Muslim and bad Muslim, good migrant and bad migrant. And it's through these liberal racisms where there's, as Michelle Alexander, for example, has written about in the war on drugs in the United States, we're talking about the mass incarceration of Black youth, is this post-racial society that is no longer really attuning to how these social conflicts, be it the war on terror, be it the war on drugs, the war on gangs, the war on knives, all of these are racialized social conflicts, but are assuming this colorblind veneer. Now, I'm going to talk about the different ways this colorblindness operates. One is sort of this erasure of race. Another one is this abstraction through psychology, which is very significant. But I'll just draw an example because if we're looking at the impact of these policies in practice, there was a Muslim woman, a niqabi woman, who went to see a mental health professional for trauma. And the mental health professional told her that one of the signs of successful treatment will be her ability to remove her niqab. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've heard that. And these are sort of cases that I've been hearing sort of over and over again in different ways. And now we understand that sort of that, you know, that statement that the therapist said, he made it with a smile, right? He's really saying it in support of this woman, you know, trying to liberate her. And I think anyone who's listening immediately understands upon which, you know, which register this logic is operating upon. And immediately also, I should mention, the Muslim woman was afraid of a prevent referral. So there's this very embodied experience that is quite significant then. You know, it's this securitized space, which then becomes, which was very implicit, but then becomes explicit through this sort of discourse, which I'm going to get at. So in my research and my writings, I talk about the various forms by which prevent, in a liberal democracy, can't go out and say, go catch Muslims. It does do that, and it has done that. And in fact, there's been examples of trainings whereby, you know, they've explicitly been doing that, but really is trying to do the opposite, you know, so it's trying to defend itself from the accusation of racism. And one way it's done that is by simply in prevent training. So this picture was sent to me by a psychiatrist, a Muslim psychiatrist, who was very, very angry about his prevent training. And it says here, what factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? You have 4 options: deprivation, bullying, attending the local mosque, adolescence. And he's the one who put that red arrow there. It wasn't me. So he sent me the picture during my ethnography, and he was very, very angry, right? And again, there's an element here of the anger that we also have to, I'm not just checkboxing his anger. There's something that's very relevant in that experience, which goes beyond just the significance of this training. But the whole point of this attending the local mosque is that you're not supposed to check it, right? So you're supposed to go through the training, and then if you check that box, you go to the screen and it tells you, oh, no, it's not about just a child attending a local mosque. Go back and go through the training, uncheck it. So there's this raising these racial signifiers and erasing it, you know? So is it a woman putting on a hijab? No. Is it a man growing a beard? No. So there's this performative colorblindness. It's constantly trying to erase the significance of how terrorism and threat is racialized in public consciousness. That's one of the ways it does it. The other way is abstracting racism. This is the one I'm really going to focus on. I just realized now this picture is cropped, but it's fine. So the significance of medicalization of terrorism as a metaphor is actually quite prevalent across the global north. And there's this idea, as you can see here with the pill, that prevention is better than the cure, right? So there's this idea that if, you know, individuals develop that sort of medicalized resilience, you know, they have a stronger body, they're healthier, you know, they won't be so vulnerable to these ideological viruses. So the notion here, which we're going to sort of unpack in the next few slides, is that anyone can be radicalized. And often when I'm presenting this, especially to more general conferences that might be related to, let's say, psychology, whatever it might be, you know, there's a point here of self-reflection whereby everyone in the room has to understand that the message this picture is trying to bring across is that we're all equally susceptible to radicalization, which of course is that abstraction of the war on terror, right? It's the abstraction of the racialization of threat through medical talk. And if you go through prevent training, it doesn't double down. It's the foundation of counter extremism in the UK, and increasingly I can also bring out examples across the global north, whereby there's this insistence on this very psychologized frame of vulnerabilities, right? So here, what's behind, if someone is changing their behaviors, you're supposed to think about what could be behind it. You know, could it be loss, sense of grievance, you know, peer pressure, mental health issues, radicalization. And so you're already sort of being introduced to this idea as there's an author by the name of DeVos. He talks about this, the form of psychologization is that we're all psychologists, right? So that's sort of what counter extremism is sort of introducing. It's not introducing, but it's sort of building upon, is that we're all co-psychologists. We can all sort of identify these vulnerabilities among one another. And if you look at the sort of common phrases from people who have been turned away from radicalization process, talking about those who tried to radicalize them. So you're gonna get statements like, it made me feel special, it gave me confidence, you know, it made me feel part of something. Again, there's this universalism to it, right? There's the fact that we all share in our common humanity, in our shared psychological configurations, this capacity to become radicalized, that there's an objective method of being able to capture these psychological configurations. But most importantly, this is something that really can't be understated or overstated rather. There is an element of benevolence. And in a way, for a liberal democracy to really be able to employ such racist policies, I mean, especially in the UK, and make it a public health policy, it has to really hinge on the benevolence of the side disciplines, right? It's this idea of, I can help you, right? If someone feels lost, they want to feel like they're a part of something. Well, we'll make you feel like you're a part of something. It just won't be terrorism, right? So there's this element of benevolence that's always been attached through the Psi discourse. Now, what we know also in research, obviously in CVE research, is that it's not entirely just Psi, you know, it's not entirely just psychologized. You know, the most common sort of frameworks are often a mix between the psychological and ideological. And what's really interesting in Prevent is that it's really when these notions of ideology then are sort of brought up, where it becomes almost intensely racialized. If you look at this, so this picture I'm sharing with you here is one that you can find on a flyer. If you go here to a hospital, or if you go online, it mentions, after all the vulnerabilities that I just spoke about, all these psychologized vulnerabilities, now it's going to talk about, well, what about the sort of grievances that people might have? And here it's still attempting to take this colorblind approach. But notice in terms of the grievances, it mentions the following are examples of grievances which may play an important part in the early indoctrination of vulnerable individuals in the acceptance of radical view and extremist ideology, a misconception and or rejection of UK foreign policy, very racialized, right? Distrust of Western media reporting, the very usage of Western there is inherently racialized. It's inherently speaking about Muslims because, you know, obviously, you know, if we're talking about the far right, they might not employ Western in such a sense. You know, it harkens back to this idea of the West versus the rest. And of course, most glaringly, perceptions that UK government policy is discriminatory. For example, counter-terrorist legislation. And you can get this in healthcare right now. So there's a sort of unfolding, you know, this unfolding and refolding of trying to maintain this colorblindness through the Psi disciplines. But inevitably, the racist enterprise of the war on terror always reveals itself. And so that's why I call it performative, because essentially what the government is trying to do is constantly maintain a veneer of colorblindness, which keeps falling apart. So there's a few elements here, which is very, very important, which I'm not going to insist on for too long because it might get a little bit too theoretical. But just to sort of so that we can understand the impact that this is having and is going to have increasingly on the Muslim community here, especially in the UK. First of all, this notion of therapeutic ethos. So what Prevent is doing, what the government is doing, they're not psychologizing counter-extremism. It's the fact that modernity itself is already psychologized. The notions, the sort of conceptions of the self, are highly psychologized. And if I'm going to define psychologization, the basic definition of it is the reduction of social political phenomena into individual problems. But I think a far more relevant definition given by James Nolan in his book, The Therapeutic State, is the language of vulnerability, is that the language of vulnerability reflects a system of meaning upon which the state enacts the political. So the language of vulnerability is already pre-existing, right? And my thesis is that psychologization is necessary to evade the charge of racism in the management of Muslim political agency through the war on terror. And there's a long history here of trying to manage, obviously, Muslims through the psi disciplines, which, so there's nothing novel here. What's novel is the way it's employed. And so, again, maybe not to insist too much on this theory, but I think there's very interesting sort of overlaps in discussions between sort of the history of the psi disciplines and the management of ideal citizenry, and sort of the critical Muslim studies and ways of trying to understand how Islamophobia operates in practice. Nicholas Rose has spoken very much at length at sort of how the psi disciplines have been there to sort of manage between a citizen and anti-citizen. And Salman Saeed talks about the sort of distinction between the Musulman, sort of the pacifist, and the double Muslim, sort of the aggressor or the fanatic. And so all of this plays into this discourse of biopolitics and the management of risk, which is highly racialized, to sort of create the conditions whereby to try to capture individuals who might potentially become vulnerable in the future, and to protect the public from these anti-citizens. So this has been a long sort of established reality. Now in practice, and this is where things become really important to sort of understand the impact of this, is now what we're going to increasingly see, not only here in the UK, but what we're seeing that's being sort of exported as a model that I know is happening in Quebec, is happening in the United States and other places, is public health approach to counter extremism in the war on terror. And so one of the things that's very interesting, if you look just at that left circle, so one of the reasons why I tell people why we shouldn't make the argument that that the reason why Prevent is racist is because there's more Muslim referrals than far-right referrals, is precisely in this logic of psychologization. It's precisely the frame of vulnerability. And here is sort of the proof in the pudding. If you look at the amount of Prevent referrals, it doesn't, the actual number doesn't matter, just look at the percentages. The percentage of Islamist radicalization was 24%. And the far right or right-wing radicalization was 24%. But look at this giant chunk right here, this huge chunk of the pie, 38%, the biggest chunk of all of them. It's mixed, unstable, or unclear ideology. And this is now potentially one of the sort of the biggest red flags that I've seen, that's sort of in terms of the development of, or the evolution of counter extremism, is that now there's these huge chunks of people who are being referred to through counter extremism, through Prevent, for the sake of counterterrorism, without any overt ideological leanings. And the only way we can actually understand how this is happening is through processes of psychologization, whereby there's a certain conception of normality, normal behavior. It becomes highly racialized then through the social conflict of the war on terror. And I'll give you an example of this. So this is through an FOI, Freedom of Information request. I'll be writing a lot more on this in the future. But we know there's these mental health hubs that are being developed all across the UK. Well, there's 3 that we know of right now. And in one of the cases, the police have written a case file on an individual for this mental health hub. And essentially the individual that they picked up was someone who was walking around a tourist site and was acting very, very strange. So sort of going around tourist site, we're obviously unsure of the exact behaviors, but they picked up this individual and they referred them to this counterterrorism mental health hub, whereby the individual through Prevent, right? So that person would have been counted within this 38%, where that person was diagnosed with a psychotic episode. Now, what's very telling in that story is the absence of race and the racialization of an individual, right? So clearly there was someone whose appearance provoked that sort of association with threat. And what we're seeing increasingly, I've been hearing referrals of youth who, let's say, speak angrily about certain things, or someone in the NHS setting who, for example, a Muslim woman who was angry during Prevent training itself. And I mean, she wasn't necessarily angry in the sense of speaking out loudly or whatnot. She was really she was upset that Prevent training was taking place in the NHS. And a Prevent referral was made on her, even though she's a staff member. So there's this idea of trying to create that language for what is sort of the ideal behaviors, thoughts and behaviors of Muslims. And I think for the sake of time, as I know I'm out of time, I'm going to end here. And if there's any more thoughts on how this is translating across the world, I can bring that up later.
Thank you, Yunus. Very interesting to get the inside view on these checklists. It's definitely concerning. I'm sure we'll have some questions about it. You made me feel like an adult for the first time this week. I'm excited and very special presentation. Right. What other language? What are the other 12 things I need to say? I feel like an adult. I'm excited. I feel like I belong to something. Right. Okay. It's ridiculous. Okay. Don't refer me, please. I won't travel to the UK ever again. All right. Our next presenter is Fahed Qureshi, who is a lecturer in sociology and criminology at Staffordshire University. He graduated with a PhD in sociology from the University of Kent, and before this, he graduated with a master's in science in criminology, criminal justice, specifically research methods, from the University of Oxford, and also a bachelor's with honors in criminology, forensic science from the University of Northumbria. Fahed lectures and conducts research in areas of Islamophobia, racism, crime, counterterrorism, political Islam, and radicalization. And recently, he's focusing on UK's Prevent counterterrorism strategy with a specific interest in the institutionalization of Islamophobia. Fahed, it sounds like Prevent's the topic of the day. Why don't you enlighten us more on this program? 20 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. I want to start as well by thanking the organizers for putting the conference on, and also for inviting me, and also to say thanks to Darek for his excellent presentation and the work that he's doing at the moment. What I want to do is I want to present some early findings from some research that I've been doing on the implementation of the Prevent duty in higher education. And in particular, I want to show how liberal equality, diversity, and including the genders have been complicit in institutionalizing the Islamophobia of Prevent. Oh, sorry, I just need to turn my camera on. Is that on?
Yes, it's on. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so in particular, I want to show how liberal equality, diversity, and inclusion agendas have been complicit in institutionalizing the Islamophobia of the Prevent duty, both in the way that they've been used to make the argument for a disciplining of the Muslim presence on campus, but also in blocking anti-racism initiatives by centering individual narratives of EDI managers about a commitment, about their personal commitments to anti-racism, that oftentimes negates the need for broader institutional anti-racism awareness and training. Now, a key area in which the Prevent Duty has normalized Islamophobia is in higher education, is in debates about ensuring free speech on campus. This is a particularly curious discussion point because it's the Prevent strategy that's been accused itself of stifling debate and discussion on campus. The freedom of speech debate, particularly when it concerns discussions about the Prevent Duty, emerged in the context of external speaker policies that had to be created as part of the Prevent Duty to manage the kind of people that come onto campus and what they have to say, to try to prevent extremism from flourishing on campus. These external speaker policies oftentimes use very subjective markers to do this controlling, markers such as controversial and contentious, to decide about which speakers and which topics can come onto campus and what kind of events can be held on campus, and which events should not be held on campus. And oftentimes this happens through a risk assessment process. So the due diligence processes are also problematic because they include clauses such as, and I'll just read out the three key ones. Firstly, has the person previously been known to express views that might be considered controversial? Secondly, has the person been banned from speaking at another university? And thirdly, will the speaker or the topic attract others that might be considered controversial? Now, these markers naturally gravitate towards identifying Muslim speakers as controversial, because the othering of Muslims that makes Muslim speakers and also topics such as Islamophobia and war on terror controversial in the white space of higher education. Islamophobia very much sits at the heart of these policies because they construct Muslims as intolerant to freedom of thought and ideas, and in doing so, they oftentimes reinforce classic Islamophobic tropes about the backwardness of Muslims. EDI concerns about the need to ensure an inclusive space in higher education are oftentimes used to restrict Muslim political activity to protect people of all groups because of the supposed intolerance and fundamentalism of Muslim groups in politics. So, for example, concerns about anti-Semitism inherent to Muslims and Islam being deployed to restrict and control the Muslim political activity in Palestine solidarity groups, for example. The data that I have shows that this is oftentimes enforced and Muslims are disciplined. Security guards are oftentimes present at events and monitor who enters and who exits. Demands that events are screened beforehand so that they can be regulated or banned. And also a very scrupulous enforcement of bureaucratic administrative procedures, double and triple checking forms and demanding high fees for security presence, and where oftentimes if documentaries are shown, demanding high license fees for them to be shown, all in an attempt to try to discourage that from happening. And I've seen numerous cases in which this has happened since the introduction of the Prevent Duty in higher education. So for instance, at one institution that I worked at during a lecture on Islamophobia on a university campus as part of Islamophobia Awareness Month, the university, without consulting the organizers, arranged for a security presence that checked people's ID and also their bags before they entered the lecture theatre. And Muslims became very anxious about security on the door and also about what it's in the message that it sent. And it reminded them about the Islamophobic lens that the university was using to view them and their activity, people who don't essentially respect freedom of speech, and therefore had to be securitized to ensure that the freedom of speech of everybody else prevails. There was also at this event an undercover security presence that the organizers weren't aware about. And the university management overrode considered judgments about concerns of a security presence. In their words, they were protecting Muslims from far-right attacks. And so, almost sort of neutralizing those accusations of Islamophobia. Another time, a university invited the director of public relations from the UK Israeli embassy, and the Prevent Duty, even in that case, required that the event was balanced by an opposition speaker. But university management rebutted these kinds of claims about a lack of balance by reiterating the importance of liberal notions of freedom of speech and debate on campus. One of the participants told me they were told by management, we believe the students can handle the debate. And that's nice, but that isn't a privilege that's afforded to Muslim speakers and Muslim students. And so in response to all of this, in some cases, student Muslim societies have organized around sensitive issues as a way of asserting their right to do so, oftentimes through Islamophobia Awareness Month, Islamic Awareness Week, and things like that. And oftentimes, higher education institutions view these acts of resistance to a stifling of Muslim politics and dissent as direct threats of extremism, or indirectly creating the conditions for extremism on campus by creating threatening environments that demand extra layers of security and bureaucracy. And so the Prevent Duty discursively associates Muslims and Islam with radicalization and terrorism, and it makes it very difficult to host events on issues to do with Muslims and Islam because of its supposedly sensitive nature, and requires external speaker procedures and risk assessments, which is an extra layer that has an impact of targeting disproportionately Muslim speakers and events. And so the Prevent Duty in higher education creates an environment in which Muslim identity is oftentimes threatened, and Muslim students are reported feeling excluded. And so Islamophobia, interestingly, is practiced in higher education in the name of anti-racism and safeguarding. The language of anti-racism and EDI agendas is deployed to justify the practice of Islamophobia on campus, which is itself seen as a commitment to anti-racism. And in doing this, external speaker policies and risk assessments play a key role in constructing and reinforcing the image of Muslim extremism on campus that needs to be identified, monitored, and regulated. These agendas these EDI agendas and anti-racism agendas are oftentimes utilized by higher education institutions to present as committed anti-racists when they're also complicit in the practice of Islamophobia, which can go unchallenged. Now, of course, in theory, and this is something Tariq was talking about as well, and particularly in his work on colorblindness, this policy applies to everyone in higher education. But at one institution, there was a distinction. At one institution in the UK, there was a distinction that was made between the types of threat that the Prevent strategy would target. White members of staff who could, because of, say, for example, their politics, be subject to the constraints of the external speaker policy, try to distance themselves from the clutches of Prevent by articulating the threat of Islamic terrorism and extremism as distinct from that which could be posed by left liberal politics to the external speaker policy. And at this institution, non-Muslim white staff were uncomfortable with being targeted and managed by a law that was created for them, i.e. Muslim terrorists, extremists, and criminals, and so on, and uncomfortable with being associated with them. So to resolve this, attempts were made to try and nuance the application of Prevent in a way that distinguished them from us. One way this happened was through an understanding of notions of security. On the one hand, security as the physical security of a building against an outside threat, and on the other hand, security against an ideological threat as posed by, for example, Muslim extremist speakers. Non-Muslim white staff argued that if these events required security, then it should be understood as security outside of the remit of Prevent in the first category, and that the true application of Prevent should be against terrorists and extremists in the second category, and it almost resulted in a two-tier application of Prevent. Those events that were organized by non-Muslim white staff situated in the first category, with a risk assessment identifying security that is about protecting the physical space from others that might disrupt it, whilst those events organized by Muslims situated in the second category, with a risk assessment requiring a security in the language of Prevent against an ideological threat. And this was an attempt at rescuing themselves from the moral burdens of Prevent policing by pointing to race and religion as markers of safety. Now, higher education institutions present as open liberal spaces of tolerance and learning, and so they expend a lot of energy to navigate around the uneasy discussions and about the institutionalization of Islamophobia of the Prevent duty. A commitment to EDI agendas, pointing to the existence of EDI departments and managers and practitioners has been key in this regard. We can't possibly be racist because we believe in the equalities agenda. But EDI departments and agendas have been central in blocking anti-racism initiatives and neutralizing claims of Islamophobia of the Prevent duty by centering individual narratives of EDI practitioners about a commitment to anti-racism that oftentimes negates the need for broad institutional anti-racism awareness. And this happens in a number of ways. First, there's a relatively little value that's placed on anti-racism awareness in PREVENT training courses that all public sector employees are required to take part in the UK. At one institution in which I was involved in the process, EDI practitioners were central in cutting down anti-racism awareness to a single PowerPoint presentation slide to allow for more space to discuss the terror threat. And even then, the EDI department provided some material on unconscious bias, which presented racism as an unconscious phenomenon or an individual phenomenon, and therefore ignored the deliberate Islamophobia of the PREVENT strategy. One EDI practitioner said, quote, "Let's not delude ourselves. There are plots happening. Are you saying that it's all made up?" In emails to the PREVENT group about the progress with the PREVENT training that was being developed by EDI practitioners, they would oftentimes complain about the sections on Islamophobia, anti-racism as being labored and as being too long and as needing to be cut down. So this also feeds into a broader denial of Islamophobia and the personal culpability for it, as numerous EDI practitioners pointed to the fact that they were bound by the law to implement the PREVENT duty and that the content was beyond their control, but that they had to raise awareness of the terror threat and radicalization rather than anti-racism, that was the legal nature of the duty. One participant told me that he was told, quote, we should just have it so that we cover awareness of PREVENT, safeguarding in the referral process, and then just have one slide that says, and there have been some suggestions that PREVENT has also been problematic in stifling academic freedom and reinforcing racism and Islamophobia. We don't need the material on raising awareness on racism and Islamophobia because it isn't what we're training our staff to do. We're not being Islamophobic, but we need these policies to protect against Islamic radicalization and the terror threat. Another means by which this unease of PREVENT Islamophobia is neutralized and blocked by EDI practitioners is by what Hia and Warren call marking progress. This involves the deferring of blame away from themselves towards senior managers and external authorities that are responsible for monitoring compliance with the PREVENT duty, with claims that they wouldn't accept more than the most basic content on unconscious bias because it takes away from the content on terrorism, the terror threat and radicalization and so on. At the same time, EDI practitioners defend the institution. Some of the EDI managers that I've interviewed defend the institution by pointing to the involvement of the EDI department in implementing the PREVENT duty as a rare, oftentimes rare progressive move in comparison to the broader national higher education context for which the institution, for which that particular institution ought to be praised. We deserve credit for this approach, for indulging a critique of PREVENT and for indulging discussions about unconscious bias, one practitioner told me. So marking progress in this way oftentimes shifts the focus away from the issue of Islamophobia in PREVENT duty to the progress that has been made on the understanding of the issue, and it almost it is an attempt at changing the channel on the discussion. And then finally, posturing has also played a big role in this process because practitioners themselves have positioned their engagement with PREVENT as a progressive one to try and convince themselves of their progressive credentials whilst engaging in an inherently racist policy. In interviews, they talk about the difficulties and the agonies and talk about it in very sort of labored, emotional ways, about the agonies of producing PREVENT awareness training and implementing PREVENT. And you use that as a way of positively reflecting on their own sort of nuanced, considered approach. I actually also think that the anti-racism training material that was attempted to be included in some of these training courses perhaps exacerbated these tensions around working on a racist policy as EDI practitioners, which is probably why they wanted to see it culled. Part of their attempts to be considered anti-racist supporters is an attempt at convincing themselves that they're good people who just aren't prejudiced. And in some interviews, EDI practitioners understood broader arguments about Islamophobia and counterterrorism, but they would expend a lot of emotional labor to reject them in the context of the PREVENT duty because they, as progressive EDI practitioners, were involved in these processes, which would also implicate them if they accepted that it was also racist. One participant of a Prevent group at a higher education institution talked about the rising tensions as policies started being created. EDI and safeguarding practitioners could no longer hide, they told me, behind the facade of equality and tell themselves how progressive they were because the policies being created at that institution in response to the Prevent duty were Islamophobic and were targeting Muslims. And so the group dynamics changed and became much more awkward, filled with nervous laughter and smiles, trying to be overtly polite and nice, to redirect concerns about the implementation of an Islamophobic policy and remain as distant as possible from any accusations of Islamophobia. To conclude, what I've argued is that cultural narratives which frame radicalization as an Islamic problem and guide counterterrorism practice have institutionalized Islamophobia in higher education with the Prevent duty because Muslim political activity and presence is read and understood through the lens of Islamic extremism or the potential for extremism on campus that requires a management of the Muslim presence. And so consequently, the institutionalization of Islamophobia with the complicity of EDI agendas limits the politics of Muslim students, and it also situates some of the threat to be viewed that needs to be managed to secure the campus against their presence. As Salman Sayyid argues, because Muslims are not necessarily considered to be a race of people, we can have a racism without racists that can target Muslims and defend itself against accusations of racism. It's the only way it can operate in a supposedly progressive space of higher education, because as the data shows, as a rational response to the terror threat faced by the West, as articulated by EDI practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fahed. Be ready for some interesting questions. I have a few myself that I'm excited to ask. Thank you for the information. Our next speaker, switching continents and countries to the United States, is Lina Al-Arian. She is based in Washington, D.C. She's a Palestinian American human and civil rights activist. She lives in Boston currently. She's executive director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, which is an organization that advocates on behalf of war on terror prisoners and their families. She has worked at a number of human rights and justice nonprofit organizations, including American Muslims for Palestine, United Voices, and the Middle East Children's Alliance. She has a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago, and she's a contributor to the volume Being Palestinian: Personal Reflections on Palestinian Identity in the Diaspora, which is published by Edinburgh University Press. Very good book. It's interesting. Lina, thank you for joining us. How are things in the United States? It's been an interesting year and couple months.
Yes, it has. Yeah. Thank you, Abed, for the warm introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Yeah, it's been a challenging year. So thank you to our esteemed panelists who touched on the securitization of Muslim youth after 9/11 and the intersection of racism and Islamophobia. I extend my deepest thanks to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for organizing this conference that was sadly postponed actually from last year in the wake of the global pandemic. Yeah, I think it's fitting that we're doing it this year in 2021, 20 years since the start of the so-called war on terror, a forever war that continues to devastate Muslim communities around the world. So I was asked to speak today about the human impact of the war on terror, focusing, as you said, Abed, on the US context. It's a topic that I work daily on as an advocate, and also one that I've lived and breathed since my childhood. Usually when we encounter research on the costs of the war on terror, it largely focuses on one end of the spectrum, the immediate violence and atrocities inflicted on Muslim bodies, mostly abroad. We know that hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in the wars waged after 9/11. In horror, we follow the abomination that is the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, which was created in the shadow of black sites where prisoners were subjected to torture and held for nearly 2 decades, in the extrajudicial killings and drone strikes that have claimed countless lives. In the US, Muslim charities and institutions were shut down, leaders targeted and arrested, and communities criminalized and infiltrated by federal and local law enforcement. But what often goes unseen is the manner in which these disastrous policies affect hundreds of Muslim families whose proximity to those individuals condemned as quote unquote terrorists by the state isolates them from their own communities out of fear. The tactics employed by government agencies, primarily the FBI, but also the court systems, and in some instances, local police, during the so-called domestic war on terror is what I will focus on in my talk today. As you'll see, these tactics, which can be summed up as a modern day COINTELPRO, are all done in service of disciplining a community viewed as merely possessing the potential to pose a threat to a white supremacist imperialist order. And these are things that, especially, the effects of disciplining the community that you just heard our previous speaker touch on. After 9/11, the crackdown on Muslims in the US was almost immediate, from thousands of immigrants requiring special registration and being rounded up in detention centers to a rash of hate crimes and laws being passed like the Patriot Act that expanded the government's already vast powers. Although there was no doubt that this was a turning point in the civil rights of Muslims, for many of us, our struggles began in the years prior to 9/11. That includes my father, Sami Al-Arian, whom many of you know. He was a professor and anti-war activist who advocated for Palestinian liberation and the civil rights of Muslims in America. He was targeted in the 90s by Islamophobic and right-wing operatives for Israel who used the US media to launch their attacks, which ultimately led the FBI to raid our home and take boxes of our personal possessions with them, including the writings and drawings of us children. I remember what it felt like at just 10 years old to come home to a house that was turned upside down after every inch of it was raided by the FBI. I remember the anxiety I felt hearing footsteps of agents sneaking around our backyard during illegal searches and seizures. And even more bizarrely, I now remember the conversations I had at that time, since years later, I'd be forced to listen to my own voice on phone recordings stored on hundreds of CDs and boxes while preparing for my father's trial. Ironically, while he was being surveilled in the target of a malicious investigation and relentless spear campaign in the local paper, my father was regularly traveling to lobby on Capitol Hill. As one of the few Muslim activists with influence in Washington, he was also a leader of the Tampa Muslim community and had founded the school and mosque we all attended. He campaigned against the unconstitutional use of secret evidence that was used to detain innocent Arabs and Muslims in the 90s, most notably my uncle Mazen al-Najjar, another Palestinian intellectual and activist. My uncle was unjustly imprisoned for 5.5 years until his deportation a few short months before my father's arrest, or as we call it, Volume 2. During my uncle's case, it was shocking to many people that the government could detain someone indefinitely and without charging them with any crime while insisting that any alleged evidence they had was a national quote unquote secret, so that no one, not the individual, not the defense, nor a jury could ever see it. In a major effort to free my uncle and those like him, my parents launched a national campaign to end the use of secret evidence. For his efforts, Newsweek magazine declared my father at the time the premier civil rights activist in the country. Not long after, in February 2003, the FBI raided our home once more in the early morning hours. But this time they arrested my father and vowed he'd never emerge as a free man. That day, Attorney General John Ashcroft delivered a nationally televised press conference declaring him a terrorist. My father would spend the next several years in prison, 4 of them in solitary confinement. Our community was gripped by fear and wanted nothing to do with my family. My mother was told she was not welcome at the mosque that my parents helped establish. But after 12 years and an $80 million trial, the US government was forced to drop the charges because they had no evidence. He was then deported to Turkey, a country he had never been to, in which he didn't speak the language, and away from all his children and grandchildren. The worst thing is that, in spite of all of this, we were one of the lucky ones. The case of Sami al-Arian is still considered a best case scenario for how a terrorism prosecution could go in the United States. There are many others, like the leaders of the largest Muslim charity in America, the Holy Land Foundation, who are currently serving life in prison by the government's own admission for simply giving charity to Palestinian widows and orphans. Or Tariq Mahanna, a young pharmacist who was sentenced to 17 years and held in a discriminatory and highly restrictive communications management unit in a federal prison dubbed Guantanamo North, literally for translating so-called terrorist documents from Arabic to English, confirming to us all that speech by Muslims is indeed criminalized in this country. Or Afia Siddiqui and Ahmed Abu Ali, victims of extraordinary rendition who are serving horrific life sentences in federal prison under extremely punitive conditions after being tortured abroad at the behest of the US government. Their cases will be discussed in depth during this conference by their family members, and I would strongly encourage you all to attend those talks. The FBI would eventually move beyond targeting Muslims solely for their religious beliefs and political activism in order to justify its massive budget and to perpetuate the narrative of a domestic terrorism threat. The FBI began thwarting imaginary acts of terror it concocted entirely on its own. By recruiting criminal informants and deliberately targeting vulnerable young Muslims, many of whom suffer from mental health issues, the FBI began manipulating these individuals and creating incentives, especially financial ones, as we've seen in a number of cases, such as the Newburgh 4 and the Liberty City 7, for them to carry out fake terror plots that the, quote, heroic FBI would step in at the last possible moment to stop. One example is a student from Boston named Rizwan Firdos, whom the FBI acknowledged was very obviously mentally ill to the point where he had to wear adult diapers. Rizwan was targeted in a sting operation, but when he began receiving psychological treatment and started to back out of the plot, he was immediately arrested. He's now serving a 17-year sentence for a manufactured crime based on racist profiling and criminalization of Muslims. Hundreds of others were similarly targeted through this tactic, many of whom are still in prison today. As the number of these political prosecutions skyrocketed, my father, a political prisoner under house arrest at the time, brought together human rights activists, criminal defense attorneys in October 2010 to form a coalition that would advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the so-called war on terror. The goal was to join local groups such as Friends of Human Rights in Tampa, Florida, and Project Salam in Albany, New York, that had been organizing around cases targeting members of their community with national organizations such as the Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Lawyers Guild to tackle this issue head on. Most importantly, with the involvement of prisoners and their family members from the very beginning, this organization, which now goes by the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, was guided and led by those directly impacted. CCF rose to the challenge as the only organization that would provide support for impacted families, many of whom are also deliberately targeted by the state. Many families have described to me the routine harassment they face during travels, being threatened by the government themselves and being asked invasive questions such as whether or not they pray, the surveillance and trauma from a loss of privacy, losing access to housing, and being treated as a criminal despite having no record whatsoever, having their fundraising campaigns online shut down by crowdsourcing platforms, their bank accounts closed without reason, and even denied the ability to send money transfers to loved ones or friends. In one particularly egregious incident, the government went after the wife of the HLF leader Ghassan al-Ashi, who was serving an unjust 65-year sentence, and confiscated her wages. The designation of political prisoners' families members as essentially enemies of the state is also part of a deliberate strategy by federal agents to encourage their own communities to abandon and isolate them. After the arrest of my father, the FBI began visiting several members of our community, regardless of how close they were to us, both at their homes and places of business. It was a clear campaign of fear and intimidation, and it was replicated in communities around the country. The surveillance of mosques by the FBI, its paid informants, and local police forces led Muslims to depoliticize their spaces and draw lines about what topics were allowed to be discussed. And to put things in perspective, a few years ago, I'm sure the number has increased. An estimated 15,000 informants were reported to be deployed in Muslim communities. Where the mosque was once a place where Muslims would organize a protest or a campaign around a political issue, in post 9/11, it looks very different. Some studies have reported that many young Muslims feel unable to properly express their political opinions in mosques, largely due to both the government surveillance efforts and governmental policing programs, such as the Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE initiatives, which our previous speakers spoke on. CVE, which is based on the UK's own PREVENT program, is an approach to, quote, preventative policing that uses key indicators to identify potential so-called radical extremist Muslims. The CVE framework, seen in other countries like France, ultimately promotes the idea that any Muslim who harbors political views that are critical of US empire, who embraces their religious identity as a political one, or who even engages with elements of the Islamic tradition that the state has deemed, quote, radical, or anywhere from wearing one's pants or growing one's beard at a length deemed suspicious by the state, or attending mosque for dawn prayers. In short, anyone who is a visible Muslim has the potential to be an extremist. Although CVE funding is not nearly what it was during the Obama years, with many leaders and institutions shamed for taking CVE funding, what's important is to understand how the dangerous assumptions behind CVE have become internalized among many Muslims, including community leaders. 20 years after the launch of the War on Terror, we unfortunately see a rise of Muslim organizations in North America and Europe that were created and function in service of the security state. These organizations have employed and in some instances weaponized Islamophobic rhetoric to marginalize critical voices and distinguish themselves as the, quote, good Muslims, and have attempted to define and control the parameters of engagement with the state. Programs designed to normalize relationships between Muslims and right-wing Zionist and anti-Muslim organizations are also intended to disrupt and weaken the political identity of Muslims on issues that once unified them. Mainstream Muslim organizations have also largely avoided tackling issues involving the criminalization of their communities in the context of the War on Terror, with national Islamic conferences becoming more like self-help seminars and imams inviting police chiefs on their mosque platforms at the height of a racial justice uprising. There seems to be a quiet yet deliberate decision on the part of Muslim leadership to distance themselves from issues that challenge the government's many abuses. 2 decades later, this new reality reflects the intended consequences behind the government's War on Terror witch hunt, to create a chilling effect in Muslim communities that would intimidate them from speaking out against global injustices and self-censor and self-police political speech. The unseen effects include the fear of expressing one's opinion at their mosque, lest they become targeted by an undercover informant. It's the fear of commenting on current affairs over the phone, wondering who might be listening on the other line. It's the fear of liking the wrong kind of Facebook post or tweet, lest it be used against you in a court of law, or even having your phone number end up in the wrong person's contact list that will make you the government's next target. Unfortunately, we know intimately that these are not just hypotheticals, but a significant part of the shameful history and victim stories that resulted in decades of unjust imprisonment. While these abuses remain the proverbial elephant in the room in most Muslim spaces, they have also created another harmful consequences in which many youths who are justifiably upset and even angry about the injustices of US wars in Muslim lands and Israel's colonization of Palestine have become alienated from their mosques, which failed to provide them with a safe space to organize around such issues. Instead, they become vulnerable targets of government-paid agent provocateurs who find them on basketball courts or at the gym, and in fact manipulate and radicalize them to go along with fake plots in a misguided attempt at seeking justice. As we reckon with the abuses of the government, we must also recognize the failures of Muslim leadership to protect their members and demand their rights as a faith community. There are many things to lament about the state of Muslims globally 20 years into the war on terror. But for me, as someone who advocates for political prisoners in the US, one of the most disheartening and troubling aspects of this work is the fact that American Muslim leaders have never been able to stop the continued infiltration and criminalization of their communities, to stop the bleeding, to at least prevent the creation of new political prisoners. What's worse is that there's never been a clear demand to end these abuses. So what can we do? I think the framing of this conference, which draws the clear and important connection between Islamophobia and the war on terror, is a critical step in identifying the problem and naming it clearly. When most Muslims think of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry, many might point to individual experiences of harassment and discrimination. But what often gets overlooked is institutional Islamophobia, which perpetuates a narrative of a Muslim threat and sustains the war on terror, which might as well be a euphemism for a war on Muslims. As any marginalized community targeted by state violence and the state security apparatus, Muslims must recognize and name the abusive tactics, the pernicious narrative, the racist policies, and the racialized targeting of our communities. We must educate ourselves about the history of the government's repression of other minority communities and activists fighting for their rights, to draw from their lessons and connect the struggles of today to the crimes of the not so distant past. We must resist attempts to intimidate us from speaking out, or efforts to divide us or stigmatize those of us working to dismantle the institutions maintaining our oppression. And at the very least, we must recognize and support our political prisoners and their families, learn their stories, speak their names, demand their freedom, and uplift their families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena, for sharing your story. I was familiar with your family situation. I was in law school as part of this was playing out, and I followed it intently. And it was one of the reasons that I became Muslim, seeing how your father was treated. That and another documentary that I watched was a turning point for me in changing my perspective and considering for one of the first times that maybe Muslims were not made out what they were said to be. And so I know it was very bad on your family and so many other families, and you're correct, as bad as it was, your father is one of the lucky ones. And he has changed lives. He's changed my life. I never thought I would have met him and would end up working with him at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. I can assure people that Dr. Sami loves the United States Constitution and democracy more than any person that I've met, more than my law professors, and he's definitely advocate for civil rights. Thank you for everything that you guys have been through.
Thank you for your kind words.
One question I have, I want to start with you, Fahed. I mentioned it in a message to you. This has been an interesting year with coronavirus as things have been switching online. All of these conferences, Zoom has taken over everything. What do we see happening in the UK with the PREVENT program and universities turning away speakers or canceling conferences where before their justification was we can't provide security, we can't keep the Muslim community safe? And so what's the excuse now? If the physical space is moving online, it would seem that everyone is safe. What's happening now that conferences are on Zoom?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the thing is, at the moment, it's a rapidly changing landscape. Okay, and things are, of course, going to develop as time goes along. Initially, as soon as we went into lockdown, initially there was no sort of approach. It was all kind of haphazard. But over since the start of this current academic year, some institutions I know have started to insist that the policies and procedures that were initially created to manage external speakers are respected and continue to be used in the normal way. Okay, so even for online conferences, and that even includes your attendance at a conference. So my attendance at this conference, for example, has had to be approved. It is a rapidly changing landscape, but there is an attempt to try and extend the prevent regulations even to this online space. And I think that, it's just because institutions don't want to be associated with things that might do them reputational damage and things of that nature. So I think that yeah, as I said, that there are attempts now to extend that into the online space.
Interesting. I know in the United States, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, has been very aggressive in making itself involved in the countering violent extremism programs, holding itself out as the expert that must be advised and consulted in everything. Do you see this as well in the UK in terms of pro-Zionist groups that are trying to stifle and shut down freedom of speech on campuses?
Yeah, I mean, there is a case at the moment actually at Bristol University with Professor David Miller. I believe he was presenting at this conference actually. And he's been accused of anti-Semitism, and there's a long-running campaign. But it's something that has been going on for quite some time actually, particularly with Palestine societies, Islamic societies, as they've been trying to organize events. From a few years ago, there was an annual Israeli Apartheid Week that was heavily targeted, and with the prevent duty, its regulation has become much more, much stricter and much stronger, and it's much more difficult to host those kinds of events and those kinds of speakers. Because the prevent duty does also cover that, so it is a much more difficult space, and it's interesting because the university has the government has now introduced freedom of speech SARs. I'm not sure if you're following this over in Turkey in the United States, but we have something called the Office for Students that monitors university compliance with a whole range of policies and legislations. And there's this whole sort of conservative freedom of speech critique of university campuses, and universities are now, governments are now introducing freedom of speech SARs, and government and universities are going to be, disciplined for not upholding freedom of speech. It's just completely ironic given the impact the prevent strategy is having on freedom of speech in campuses and whatnot.
Thank you. One more question, Fahed, before I move over to Yunus on a question. Are you seeing pressure by countries, other Muslim governments that are pressuring universities to drop speakers or to drop programs?
I mean, I've heard of that, but I don't know of any particular cases.
Okay. Or are you aware of any cases of governments encouraging targeting Muslim communities and countries? For instance, I've seen harassment of mosques in Germany that are sponsored by the Turkish government.
Oh, no. I mean, as I said, I don't know of any cases intimately, so it's not something that I'm aware of. But I've heard of it, more generally.
Thank you. Yunus, a question. based on what we've seen, the Al Arian family and what they've experienced, taking this equivalent in the UK, what does somebody do if they are thrown into one of these prevent referrals and deemed to be a threat? And what is someone supposed to do in the UK if they get caught up in this and are told that they're an extremist to their own surprise?
Yeah, khair. I mean, that's a great question. And that's essentially, I work with an NGO called MedAct, and they have sort of a securitization of health wing right now. And part of what we're trying to establish is try to think about, you know, what can people do? I mean, even for that, we're thinking about what can healthcare staff do when a healthcare staff member gets referred, right? And there's good reason to believe that in schools, I mean, it's mostly students who are getting referred, but actually in the healthcare system, a lot of staff members are getting referred, which is an interesting dynamic. I mean, I think first of all, we have to recognize, in terms of my own research, and I'm sure Fahad can also speak to this as well. But in my research and my dealings with families, etc., there's a lot of anxiety. I mean, there's a very sort of embodies powerful sort of suffocation that comes, I think, when these referrals happen. And we need to know that we need to recognize that suffocation, which I think is quite difficult to empathize with. I think what this organization, this NGO called Prevent Watch, with whom I collaborate very often, they have over 500 cases of prevent referrals of people they've been helping over years. But 500 is just tip of the iceberg, right? There's been tens of thousands of referrals to prevent. So what we see from a lot of people, from a lot of families, and from what we hear is that people generally play along, right? I mean, in a way, the best way to protect yourself is to play the good Muslim right away, right? Which is what a lot of people will do. And so I know of one mother here, all the children in a class were essentially referred through Prevent. And she was trying to get the other parents to mobilize on what happened. And nobody would, simply because, as we know what the police chief once admitted to. So there's things that are said in policy, but then we know what the reality is in practice, right? And one of the biggest sort of, I mean, I would say it's almost an outright lie, is that Prevent is a voluntary process. Now, it is voluntary, if hypothetically, but it's voluntary with a footnote. There's consequences to not following, right? So that's the issue of voluntary, is that there's inherent coercion in it. So we know from a police chief, he readily admitted that people who refuse Prevent might end up in Pursuit. Pursuit is the other sister wing within counterterrorism, i.e., you know, they're going to just fall within a whole different realm of the sort of counterterrorism apparatus. But this is something we don't even have to convey to Muslims. I think this is sort of already understood, you know, like if you know, I've been dealing with brothers and sisters who've been impacted, you know, through the war on terror for years, you know, and it's just simply understood that compliance is sort of the only necessary step into being able to get through this. At least, you know, for those who don't have those resources available to them to understand how they can actually mobilize against it, which is most people at that point. So I hope that answers your question, but because Prevent is a very long process, or there's a lot of steps to Prevent. I mean, I'll maybe just end very quickly by mentioning another point, a recent success that happened. So when a Prevent referral is made towards you, let's say you're a patient, you go to see a therapist, the therapist makes a Prevent referral. you might not know, or you most likely, I mean, I haven't seen a case otherwise, that you would know that prevent referral is made against you, right? So if a Muslim woman puts on hijab, a prevent referral might have be made against her, but it could be that the police are going to discard it. Okay. But a family last year found out that their child had a prevent referral made against them, and because every prevent referral stays in a police database for 7 years, they wanted their child's name removed from that police database, and they won. That was the first win in that regard, which is, I think, a big step. So there's a lot to be done. I think part of it is sort of getting the message out there and trying to help capture the people who are suffocating through that anxiety of a prevent referral.
Interesting. In that case that you just mentioned, do you know the age of the child by chance?
Oh, I'm not so sure. Maybe Fahid might know. I think I was definitely very young. I'm just gonna say 6, but I might be
Right.
wrong.
I'm curious because we all know in the United States and their terrorist watch list, there have been cases of babies placed on the list. A family's trying to travel and they find that they're not allowed to board or they're not allowed to travel because their child's on a terrorist watch list. They can't even talk or chew a teething biscuit, but they're somehow a threat to national security. Yeah,
Yeah,
very
precisely. I mean, it's really, I mean, it can really be anything. You know, I think a case that I bring up also, again, I think this realm between someone who appears to be vulnerable, and sort of the signifiers of Islam. So there was a case of a white woman, adolescent, a white adolescent, who was suffering from severe domestic violence, and she was seeing a mental health team, and then she converted to Islam, and that already sort of sparked some suspicions. But it was then when she put on hijab that within the sort of clinical discussions among the team, her domestic abuse was secondary to actually the possibility of radicalization. So so there's a sort of natural sort of intertwining between someone who's vulnerable, you know, like that, the perfectly, you know, the perfect good Muslim, what that image might be in people's minds, and anyone who deviates from that in some shape or form by their own choice or by the stroke of fate, you know, they're suffering, they might be going whatever. Anyone who deviates essentially falls within the realm of vulnerability to be referred to prevent.
Right. It was interesting in my background and talking to colleagues, and before I went to law school, I majored in criminal justice. I studied deviant behavior in terms of the definition of deviance being less than normal, on the bad side, and above the curve, somebody that's a genius as well is classified as a deviant. It's interesting how in the academic world, the US and the UK, the global north, likes to emphasize how every science, every field of academia is so niched and detailed and specific that you can't be a practitioner in something unless you really have the specialization. Very, very detailed, until it comes to Muslim terrorism. Then all of a sudden it's very broad strokes, two things. You're either good or you're bad. If you're pro-Palestinian, you're a terrorist. Where did the specific detail, and you know, this is a complex world we lived in, where did it go? All of a sudden, if you're a Palestinian activist, if you're a Muslim, you're automatically a terrorist. You're not allowed to criticize your government, yet if you're anyone but a Muslim, you're encouraged to criticize your government. This is the democratic process. This is lively debate. This rhetoric of good versus bad, coming back to you, Fahed, in terms of prevent, do you characterize this problem similar in the UK, that this is a cultural, societal problem, that it's all Muslims are bad and you have to take off your hijab, you can't pray, otherwise you're going to be considered you're not moderate? Is this a political issue? Is it a societal issue? Is it security? What's really the responsible problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of them, isn't it? But I think that it's not put as bluntly as that, which is something that Tariq was talking about as well. That there is a sort of a nuancing of and a color blinding of the indicators that might suggest a person is vulnerable to radicalization. And you know, I've seen prevent training courses in which when it comes to case studies, there's a deliberate attempt to obfuscate, right? So to use images of a Muslim brown person with a beard or a Muslim woman with a hijab and put a story around it to try and talk about is this person vulnerable to radicalization? And the correct answer is no, right? So it's just exactly like what Tariq was saying. It's a deliberate attempt at obfuscating all of this. On the other point that you raised about, you know, the nuance when it comes to Muslims, I think it's an interesting question, and I think that in the experience that I've had in higher education, what I find is that expertise and the nuance that you're referring to is really a problem to the implementation of what are political agendas, political objectives, policies, legislations, practices, and they're inconvenient because they problematize a lot of the foundations. So, for example, with the introduction of the prevent duty in higher education, you know, universities have had to adopt academically unsound positions to implement a lot of these policies. You know, I was speaking, for example, about the external speaker policy. At the heart of the external speaker policy is the idea of you know, brainwashing, that we have to protect our student body from you know, charming, charismatic, expert, extremist recruiters who can potentially brainwash our student population. But we know from a whole range of disciplines, sociology, criminology, psychology, religious studies, that you know, this idea of brainwashing really, you know, this sort of idea that students are somehow open containers for all manner of brainwashing, it's just it's a heavily overplayed argument, and brainwashing, if there is something called brainwashing, it just doesn't operate in that way. You know, for people to take on ideas, those ideas have to not only speak to that person's reality, but they have to do so over a prolonged period of time. They have to make sense of that person's world and that person's reality over a prolonged period of time. So this idea that, you know, brainwashing is at the heart of radicalization and recruitment is at the heart of a lot of these policies. But when you raise that as a potential issue, it's inconvenient, and it puts a barrier and an obstacle in front of a process of implementing a legal duty that has to be implemented because it's the law, and so it becomes an inconvenience, and for that reason, expertise and nuance in the way that you were speaking about just aren't welcome in these kinds of conversations and questions.
Yeah, exactly. Don't confuse them with facts or data. Just are they good or bad? And if they're bad, can we bomb them? Right?
And you know, just to add to that, expertise and nuance are only useful when they can be used to further a particular political objective. Right. Otherwise, they're inconvenient.
Of course, right. We have a question for you, Yunus, in terms of the psychological perspective right now. Where is from a psychological perspective, where's the Muslim community now in the UK? Is it in trauma, still in trauma, or post-trauma?
That's That's a good question. A little bit interesting. I think actually Lila really said it very well about the sort of sorry, I might be now using my own words as to how you explained it, but there's this emerging theme called this affective surveillance, idea that you're just sort of constantly feeling watched. It's a very embodied experience where you're constantly under scrutiny. I think the trauma language can be quite limiting. I think it's a little bit difficult for me to unravel that here and now, because I think the issue around Islamophobia has been much more about a question of atmosphere, right? And what Prevent and all these CVE policies and everything sort of across the global north, what they're doing is that they both legitimize and securitize that feeling, right? Like even before 9/11, Muslims were already the other, right? They were already being otherized. And, you know, especially in Europe, there was a lot of discussions around integration, right? How does a Muslim other fit into sort of the European imaginary? So what Prevent and all these CVE policies and all these things are doing, they're not creating that, they're taking that and they're securitizing it, right? So what before was, you know, you either integrate or you don't belong to us anymore, is now like you either integrate or you're potentially a terrorist, right? So it's sort of taking this embodied experience of being othered, which and this relates a little bit more to my PhD research. You know, it becomes very foundational to how Muslims see themselves and develop themselves. And that's why I think trauma can be very limiting, because I think Muslims can we don't want to dismiss their agency. I think many Muslims find their faith through these experiences, right? Or they find an element of obviously resistance and obviously proximity to Allah. They can find a lot of different things. So I think Muslims react to it in different ways. And clearly, there's Muslims who potentially just give into it, right? I think, as Lila also explained before, you know, there's all these Muslims who sort of perpetuate the very thing that's asked of them. But in doing so, they make that question that's imposed upon them, the Muslim question that divides good Muslims and bad Muslims, they make it real. So the moment, every time a Muslim accepts, okay, I'm going to play to your gaze, I'm going to be the good Muslim, you know, I'm going to be the good American Muslim, I'm going to be the good British Muslim. At that very same breath, they're actually throwing someone else under the bus, because just by assuming that, they're replicating it. So that's why I think what the sort of thing that we need to do is really capture, I think, that breadth of experience. But I think in a way, maybe for a very long drawn answer, is to sort of bring it back and say, I think it's much more about an atmosphere that I think is much more sort of akin to an anxiety for people who are aware of it, which leads to what we've been talking about in terms of self-censorship, you know, that what we call a chilling effect. And I often like to remark, whenever I have an opportunity, that, you know, I think when people feel silenced in any way, shape, or form, we need to remember that silencing is not simply just the absence of words in someone's mouth, right? Silencing is a very embodied experience. And it's not just a mouth empty of words, it's a whole experience that is very powerful. And it doesn't only affect Muslims, right? I think racialized minorities as a whole can recognize it within increasingly nationalist politics.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer. Thank you. Let's go to America. Exciting year, Lena. Lots of questions for you, Lena. Let me ask a couple from our audience, and you can answer them as you're able. How do you regain your confidence and stand up to oppression after being targeted in such an extreme way?
Is this a general question, or for me personally? How do I do it? Because think for any targeted person, silence isn't an option, right? I mean, oftentimes when you are directly impacted, you're abandoned, you're isolated. I mean, I see families, they are the only, you know, supporters and spokespeople and defenders and advocates for their loved ones, you know, and you have to just channel whatever pain you have into action. I mean, it's sort of like fight or flight mode. And I think we see that a lot in our communities as well, that unfortunately there's some who are in flight, who choose to not be active, who would rather bury their heads in the sand. But thankfully, I mean, as we see on this panel, we have a lot of good people who are working on these issues, who are supporting Muslim rights, who are defending our right to exist and speak and organize freely. So how do you gain your confidence? I don't know. I mean, it's something that I don't know I necessarily have, but I sort of on a mission, you know, and you just sort of persevere through it and you continue. And I think it's important to draw connections, as I said at the end of my speech, to other oppressed communities and marginalized communities and see what the lessons were from there. You know, you have, you know, COINTELPRO started against Black activists in the 50s and 60s. We see how they've persevered, how they've continued to resist. You know, the internment of the Japanese is another important lesson of a community that was oppressed in this shameful history. So is to not see ourselves as also unique, but part of this continued oppression and targeting of marginalized communities. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the
Right.
question, but
Yeah, it's day at a time. In your opinion, what are the needs of political prisoners and their families right now?
For political prisoners, I think the main need really is just support. I mean, these are people who really were railroaded and just mistreated in every possible way. A lot of them thank us for simply supporting them and saying, you know, despite me being accused and labeled a terrorist, thank you for writing to me. Thank you for supporting me, not forgetting about me. So actually, we have a program. If people would like to follow our page, we will have an orientation for how to become a pen pal for the people that we advocate for, Muslim political prisoners. So that's the number one, is to become a pen pal, to write to them. They're very lonely and isolated in prison. If you happen to be in the vicinity of an impacted family member, to reach out to them. If you're not, reach out to CCF. That's what we're here for, is to create this network of support for family members. So, and we have a list of ways people can volunteer and help. So info@civilfreedoms.org, you can write us.
Info@civilfreedoms.org.
Mhm.
Correct, info@civilfreedoms.org. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Another question directed to you, Lena. You have implied that there's lack of leadership in the Muslim community in the US. What would you expect them to do? What can they do that they're not doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I like to bring the example of my father, not in any self-serving way, but really as a critical lesson in his secret evidence campaign. I mean, that was affecting about 24 Arabs and Muslims in the 90s. These were immigrants who were arrested and held, you know, never tried, never charged with any crime, just held indefinitely, where only the judge and, yeah, the judge, I believe, was only allowed to see the so-called evidence against them. Defense attorneys weren't able to see it. The accused wasn't able to see it. And my dad was really able to lead this national campaign around this issue, and create unity around it, where it became embraced as a campaign issue. This was a grave injustice that was happening against members of our community. And now we have hundreds of Muslim political prisoners who are incarcerated. Every day, a new political prisoner being made, you know, targeted by the government. And we haven't even been able to stop the bleeding, as I said. I mean, at some point, they weren't yet able to free the 24 or so people who were incarcerated, but they were able to stop. So you saw a shift in policy where they were no longer going after people and arresting them. And then they started freeing them one by one until eventually everybody who was held at that time was released. fast forward, 25 or so years later, and, not a peep, not even a demand, like, get the hell out of our communities, stop targeting our youths, like, leave us alone, give us our rights to worship and practice and pray freely. There isn't even a clear demand. Like, I was arguing with somebody who is the head of a mosque community about the FBI having a right to speak at their mosque. And they said, oh yeah, we let them in. And I'm just like shocked, like, how could you do that? How are you not protecting your youths? In one instance, and then I'll let somebody else speak, a Muslim political prisoner, a young man who's serving a 15-year sentence over this. I mean, the case is just so ridiculous and outrageous, but he was introduced to the paid informant through the imam at the masjid. So what does that say when you entrust that the imam that is leading you in prayer, that and this was a convert, and I haven't even spoken about the war on converts in this country, but this was a convert, and the imam introduced him to somebody who was a paid informant and said, I think that you'll get along with this person. And then eventually they became close, and the informant kept trying to manipulate him and pressure him into going along, and it's just awful. Like, whether or not the imam knew that this person was an informant or didn't they know is like equally horrifying, in my opinion. I mean, so there's just no protection of our members of the community whatsoever, and we have a long road ahead.
Right. Thankfully, I was not targeted for recruitment. Every mosque I went to was Urdu speaking, so I couldn't talk to anybody.
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. Yeah, that was funny. Including when I lived in the UK, when I lived in Scotland for a brief time in Stirling, and the mosque there is also Urdu speaking. So
yeah, but it's a problem also when the converts themselves, I mean, oftentimes a target will be approached to become an informant, and then when they refuse, the government will set their sights on them. So it's happens in multiple ways.
Just on that, can I just quickly ask you a question about that? It seems to me to be a particular phenomenon in the US, this sort of approach to entrapment and informant and so on. We have it in the UK, but it just I just want to get a sense of this, but it seems to be a far bigger problem in the US. Is that just because of differing models of policing, historical developments and stuff like that, or is there something else behind that? I mean, I'm not saying that we have that in the UK as well,
So I heard that it's actually, yeah. So actually, Dr. Asim Qureshi told me that this practice has started increasing in the UK, that they're starting to, and I think he mentioned, there are people from CAGE, that there's now more shared policing strategies where you have US police forces going and training UK police forces. So they're starting to employ these tactics. But yeah, I don't believe anyone since like maybe the 70s or 60s, like a very long time, no one has won an entrapment defense in this country. So it's very, very easy to be targeted in an unfair sting. And, Claudette Yunus mentioned it earlier, that exactly pre-crime. I mean, you think of Minority Report, the movie and the book, and this is exactly what it is. I mean, these are thought crimes and pre-crime, and these sort of low-hanging fruit FBI plots, yeah, I mean, it's so easy for them to do it, and the laws all work in their favor. It's horrifying, and they get away with it. I mean, just to go through different trials and see the things that they get away with, just lying on the stand, and now they're doing it against the right wing. I mean, the white nationalists. I mean, there was a case where it was like a mirror. Exactly a mirror example of what they do to Muslims, where there were these like drug addicted, kind of like white nationalists radicalized from Trump's rhetoric back in his campaign in 2016, who were part of this Christian militia. They didn't even know each other. And some paid informant, who was this homeless guy, the government paid him $60,000, was hired to go and introduce these three men, convince them of this plot by Somalis who are in the community, who are immigrants, just like radicalizing them and poisoning them against this community. until they, got them right at the moment where they were about to do this plot against them. And so the FBI swooped in to act as though they were protecting Muslims against these white nationalists, when in reality it was like the most cynical, twisted plot, where they employed the exact same tactics that they do against Muslims, against these people. And then they gave them the terrorism enhancement on their sentencing, which is another horrifying law, where you'll slap on 20 years to any charge, how big or small. But it's very sadistic, and I do think that it's something that's especially unique to this country.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK scene, we have, from what I know from the sort of research that I've done, we have more sort of an approach that tries to cultivate informants, which seems to me to be slightly different to the US approach. It's almost kind of brazen, open entrapment, and it's not even sort of being hidden. It's just kind of open season, try to entrap as many people as possible. I mean,
in the UK,
in the US as well.
Oh, in the US,
it seems like that.
Yes,
I don't know. I might be wrong, but it seems like that.
No, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, but in the UK case, it's more a case of cultivating intelligence sources and informants and things like that.
Which exists here too. I mean, that's why there's sort of a distinction between just informants who are informing and whatever, and the agent provocateurs, and that's where you get into the COINTELPRO type tactics, where they're actually getting people to go along with these schemes that are put on by the government.
I just wanted to mention, it's quite relevant to this, but it's also pretty funny. PC Gamer, which is a gaming magazine, it described Prevent in one sentence, which is crowdsourced snitching effort. So in a way, I think there's something about the UK about the way it responsibilizes the entire population to, in effect, act or become informants upon each other, which works a little bit differently than it could even work in the US. But it's just an interesting point.
And that's exactly what the Prevent duty does, doesn't it? I mean, it responsibilizes everybody.
Is there a lot of buy-in from UK Muslims to do they actually believe in the assumptions of Prevent, or is there sort of just wide-scale ridicule of it and just rejection? I mean, for either of you. I don't know.
That was an interesting question. So Fahed probably can speak to this much more. I'll just make a small point because I'm clearly not from the UK. But when I came in 2017 and I was doing my research to get an impression within the Muslim community, how much people actually were aware of Prevent. So once at a big sort of Muslim festival, there were thousands of people, and I was offered the mic to sort of speak about myself, talk about the research, see if anyone's interested in talking about Prevent. And I think it was indicative and something that I never really lost from that point onwards, that most people are just generally not really aware of Prevent. And if they are aware of it, they're aware of it specifically in education. So they kind of know it in relation to education. So this is very anecdotal, but they might not know that mental health settings all have the counter-extremism risk assessment established for all their patients, right? So if you go to mental health setting, some of them, you'll be screened for extremism. So I think there's a huge lack of awareness on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a general sort of, terrorism is a problem somehow, so there's this ambivalence I find, but I think maybe Fahed can maybe speak to this more. I think the moment this idea sort of transformed between, do you agree with counterterrorism strategies? And do you trust your teacher or your doctor to be able to accurately predict who's going to become a terrorist in the future? Those are two very different questions. And if you notice, the think tanks, the neocon think tanks, and anyone who's any way affiliated to the government in terms of their research is always going to hinge on the former. So they're going to do research out in the Muslim community and see, do Muslims sort of agree with any form of counterterrorism at all, right? And then you'll find probably a lot of agreement to it, right? But in terms of the actual deployment and how it's translated, there's a lot that's sort of hidden. So yeah, I'll leave Fahed to answer.
Yeah, I think what Tariq says is absolutely correct. So I think that in the general population, awareness of policies like Prevent perhaps isn't as widespread that we would like it to be, perhaps. But I think that since 2015, the PREVENT strategy became a legal duty on public sector institutions, and I think that since then there's been a step change in public understanding, and Muslim communities in particular, about what PREVENT strategy is, because professionals are having to sit through training courses and implement this strategy. So there has been a step change in that regard. Still, in the general population, perhaps not as much as we'd like it, but recently there has been an initiative in the UK that both Darek and I have been involved in to try and to raise awareness about the PREVENT strategy, because one of the things that the UK government has been doing over the last 5 years is trying to detoxify the PREVENT strategy. It is amongst informed audiences. It is a very toxic policy. Nobody speaks now about the PREVENT strategy without acknowledging the toxicity, the Islamophobia, and the racism attached to it. And I think that's something to be said. I think that's a win to have these things acknowledged, because of the sort of severe impact that they're having on Muslim communities. Mm-hmm. And sort of in an attempt to placate those criticisms, the government announced in 2019 an independent review of the strategy, but it appointed somebody that is essentially going to rubber stamp the policy. And so there was an initiative in the UK to try and get together as many Muslim organizations and individuals to pledge to boycott the independent review, to not give it any legitimacy. And it's actually a very large, broad coalition of people and organizations, between 500 and 600 signatures on the boycott pledge, including organizations that have in the past engaged with the PREVENT strategy as well and taken funding from the strategy. So I think that with the appointment of Shawcross, there has been a mobilization, and there has been a sort of a public education campaign, and that's going to continue throughout. And there are sort of discussions of creating an alternative community-led review of the PREVENT strategy. But in the broader sense, I guess what you're talking about is the assumptions as well about the PREVENT strategy. I think that it's undeniable that I think that in some pockets there are people who do accept that, and there are some very sort of big public personalities that will always sort of come out and castigate the Muslim community. Right now there's a situation going on in a school in the northwest, where one of the school teachers was showing the Charlie Hebdo pictures of the Prophet ﷺ to school children. And Muslim parents, when they found out, obviously weren't very happy, and there's protests around that. And you see, the same old public personalities castigating the Muslim community for protesting, and it's not the prophetic tradition and all this kind of stuff. But on those kinds of things, I think there is more sort of awareness now about the assumptions underpinning counterterrorism, and a rejection of that, even if people don't necessarily know what the PREVENT strategy is. Because the assumptions of the PREVENT strategy have been around for 20 years, as long as the war on terror has been around, and so people are aware of it to some extent in that way. And I think that but with the PREVENT strategy, specifically what it is, how it works, and whatnot, perhaps not as much as we'd like, not as much as awareness as we'd like, but I think that is changing since it became a public duty. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, you did. And I think that even here, like official CVE programs are sort of like, there's awareness that they shouldn't exist, that they're racist and, they're problematic. But I do still feel that it's still internalized. Like we've moved on, from organizations or institutions accepting government funding to do this, and it's sort of like we've just taken it on ourselves as community members
I think that's interesting you mentioned that, because we have something similar going on in the UK as well, including through deception as well, government deception. So what we know over the last 5 or 6 years is that what the government's been doing is creating supposedly independent Muslim community-led organizations that have actually been created at the Home Office.
Right.
And then giving those guys the funding and the narratives and the literature and saying, here you go, present this to your community as if it's your narrative. And so there has been an element of that where some actors in the Muslim community have taken that role. But oftentimes, I think you'll find that that's the only way. Really, I mean, when you look at who the sort of key people are pushing out these narratives, it's people who've got a vested interest, financial or otherwise, and I think that's not really surprising.
Right.
Can I just add very quickly? Just I'm going to say in one sentence, but this is actually it's far more significant than I think we're really all of us in general are giving attention to, which is that the dialogue around CVE is also evolving to really push towards the far right, following Capitol Hill, following just in general. So the colorblindness of CVE is also particularly pushed towards Muslims. We're not focused on you anymore. We're actually trying to protect you, right? And I think that's one of the sort of selling points that I find is very unfortunate, that will actually have a lot of purchase in the Muslim community, that prevent things like CVE is sort of the vanguard. It's going to become the vanguard of the Muslim community, and this is even more difficult than at that point to even contest.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was the other thing I was going to say, is that increasingly what we're finding is the point that I was making before was that Prevent is being hidden, in other agendas, in other initiatives. It's been hidden by giving lead to Muslim supposedly independent Muslim organizations, but it's also been hidden by being integrated into other agendas. So about 10 years ago, the Prevent strategy was being integrated into community cohesion agendas in the UK. But increasingly now it's being integrated into hate crime agendas. It's being joined together with hate crime agendas. So what you'll find is in local authorities, the person who is the Prevent organizer, the Prevent officer, will also have some responsibility for hate crime in that local authority area. And so when they approach Muslim communities, you're never really sure, are they approaching them for work around hate crime, or are they approaching them for work around counterterrorism? So there's a mixing of the two agendas there. But also the way which is rationalized is exactly what Tariq is saying, that there is a far right threat, and we need to protect your community. And that's something that, as I was saying before, you also see in the way in which EDI agendas are being made complicit in institutionalizing Islamophobia in higher education. It's for the safety and the security of the Muslim student body that we need to do this. We need to securitize your presence on the campus for your own good. So there are these sort of nefarious things that are happening now as well.
It's interesting to see what's going to happen this next year, and as Corona goes away and everyone comes back to campus, we'll see what face stays and what goes back to normal. We shall see. Thank you everyone for your participation. To remind everyone who's attending or that will watch this video slightly later, tomorrow we have 2 more sessions beginning at 5:30 p.m. Istanbul time. The conference continues the session entitled Unpacking Islamophobia's Consequences. And then the second session tomorrow that will begin at 8 p.m. Istanbul time, Autocratic Regimes and the Politics of Islamophobia. There's many interesting speakers again, and inshallah everyone can join us and attend again tomorrow. Thank you everyone. Good evening from Turkey, and enjoy your time. Thank you again.
Thank you.